What's up, guys? Welcome to my full guide to Kafka. Damage over time has been a pretty mid way of dealing damage since the game came out, and it's only been worse as more characters come out. This is especially true in Memory of Chaos, where the idea is to take as many turns as you can before the enemy. Kafka tries to solve this issue by not only providing one of the strongest, if not the strongest damage over time in the game, but enabling the activation of dot applied by other party members during her turn. At first glance, her scaling doesn't seem particularly good outside of her dot, but when you start to play around with team comps, she does a surprising amount of damage. Starting off, let's take a look at her kit. As far as her actual skills go, she isn't very complicated, but the way she plays requires a bit of setup in order to make the most out of her skills. The first thing I want to look at is her ultimate, Twilight Trill, because the dot applied by this affects most of her other skills. At rank 10, it does a moderate amount of damage to all enemies and applies a shock equal to 290% of her attack. It has a 100% base chance to shock all enemies hit and cause that shock to do 100% of its damage immediately. When you unlock Kafka's first major trace, it changes to that instead of just causing the shock to do damage, it affects all currently applied damage over time. This is what I meant when I said that there needs to be some setup. You need to wait until the enemy is loaded up with your party's damage over time to make the most out of this skill. Next, Kafka's skill, Caressing Moonlight, is very similar to her ultimate. She does pretty high damage to one target and a small amount of damage to the two adjacent targets. She also causes all damage over time applied to do 75% of their original damage. Ideally, you want to be using this skill every turn, but again, like her ultimate, you need to make sure that everyone in the party has already applied their dot. Kafka's talent, Gentle but Cruel, is the second way she can apply shock. Whenever an ally uses a basic attack, she does a follow-up attack for moderate damage and has a 100% base chance to apply the same shock that her ultimate does. Doing this has a one-turn cooldown, which is indicated by the little dot on her party frame. Lastly, her technique, Mercy is Now Forgiveness, does a small amount of damage and applies the same shock her ultimate does. Regardless of your party setup, the main goal here is to apply and maintain your shock and then detonate it with your ultimate and skill. In most cases, you're going to want to start the fight with her technique so the shock is already applied, especially if Kafka is the fastest character in the party so that she can immediately detonate it. If she isn't, a character needs to basic attack before her turn so that she can do a follow-up attack and apply her shock. For your leveling priority, you're going to want to level up her ultimate first so that the shock she applies is stronger and the detonation is larger. Next, her skill, then her talent. Since you're never going to need to basic attack with her outside of very rare instances when you're out of points and character turns are out of order, you can ignore her basic attack until after you've gotten all the major and minor traces. Speaking of which, as I said before, her first major trace makes her ultimate deal all damage over time instead of just her shock. Her second major trace grants her 5 energy whenever a shocked enemy dies, and her third major trace increases the base chance of her ultimate, talent, and technique to apply shock to 130% from 100%. The third major trace is the highest priority. Getting the extra 30% base chance to apply shock almost completely removes her need to get any effect hit rate on her relics, especially after getting the minor traces that grant effect hit rate. After you get that, then you can get her first major trace so that her ultimate makes all damage over time do damage instead of just her shock. And yes, this is a lower priority than the base chance. No matter what team you're playing, Kafka's dot is going to be the strongest and it accounts for the majority of her damage. The higher level the enemy, the higher their debuff resistance is, and getting this first is going to make doing those higher difficulty fights way easier. The only instance that this may not be the case is if you're running a triple dot team with her while leveling her up and she's mostly there to detonate everyone else's dots. If that's the case, then her first major trace takes priority. Lastly, her second major trace can be put off for a while. The extra energy is nice, and because her ultimate applies shock to all enemies, there's always going to be a shock on an enemy when it dies. The only problem is that it requires something to die, making it mostly useless during boss fights unless they have a lot of adds. Now that we've gone over her kit, let's take a look at how to actually build Kafka. For relics, there's a few options you can use that are all pretty close to each other in terms of damage output, assuming equal substats. Kafka's best in slot is going to be 4-piece Band of Sizzling Thunder, followed by 2-piece Band and 2-piece Musketeer, then 2-piece Band and 2-piece Messenger. For your planner set, you're going to want to use Space Sealing Station. Now that we know what we're farming, let's see what we're actually looking for on those pieces. Because damage over time doesn't crit, and because she has such a high base chance to apply shock from her major trace, the stat requirement is actually really simple. You want to stack as much attack and speed as you can. For her body piece, you're going to want attack percent. For boots, either speed or attack percent, but generally you're going to want speed. For her planar sphere, you'll want lightning damage, and for your link rope, you want attack percent. Substats are also pretty simple following this priority. Because of her major trace that increases the base chance of applying shock, you're not going to need that much effect hit rate to guarantee it landing. The priority of attack percent and speed can swap depending on how much you already have, but it's generally recommended to aim for 132 speed for Memory of Chaos, but even then, I would still recommend getting 132 or more if you're not doing Memory of Chaos. In the higher difficulties of both Simulated Universe and Caverns of Corrosion, bosses start to get pretty fast, so you're still going to need higher tiers of speed. If you have Kafka's Light Cone though, you're not going to need as much speed on your relics. Speaking of which, for your Light Cones, her signature Light Cone, Patience is All You Need, is going to be her best. At SI1, it gives an unconditional 24% damage buff, as well as a 4.8% speed buff that stacks up to 3 times after Kafka attacks. It also causes her attacks to apply Erode, which counts as a shock and deals 60% of her attack at the start of the turn for 1 turn. Because this is damage over time, both her ultimate and skill will trigger its damage. Good Night and Sleep Well is her second best Light Cone. For every debuff on the enemy, Kafka gains 12% damage, stacking up to 3 times at SI1. At SI5, it's a 24% damage buff. This buff also applies to damage over time. And if you haven't gotten Good Night and copies of it and aren't pulling for her signature Light Cone, then Fermata is what you're going to use. It's super easy to get to SI5 between the weekly boss and Hall of Memories, and if you can get it to SI5, it gives her 32% break effect and 32% damage to enemies with shock or wind shear, which also applies to their damage over time. If you have it, you can also use Welt's Light Cone in the Name of the World, which gives 24% damage to debuffed enemies. When Kafka uses her skills, she also gains an 18% effect hit rate and 24% attack. Because of the high base stats, this ends up being ever so slightly better than the maxed out Fermata, but the difference is so small that I wouldn't bother wasting resources on it if you're only going to use it on Kafka. Next, I want to go over what teams you're going to be using. While Kafka can be run as the only damage character, Kafka really starts to outperform other damage characters when she's partnered up with at least one other dot character. For a 4-star team, you're going to want to use Natasha, Sampo, and then either a support like Asta, Tingyan, or Pela, or another dot character like Luca. For a more premium team, Sampo is still required, but we'll be replacing Natasha with Locha and Pela with Silverwolf. Whether another support character or a third dot character is better really depends on what you've invested in or willing to invest in. Because both her skill and ultimate trigger the dot applied by all characters, having more dot sources should be better. But if the character that's applying them hasn't been invested in and their dot doesn't do much, then they aren't going to contribute anywhere near as much as a support that's either buffing Kafka's damage directly like Tingyan or shredding defense like Pela and Silverwolf. Sampo is the only dot character that can get away with less investment because its ultimate applies a 30% increased damage over time vulnerability debuff. But even then, you still need to invest pretty heavily in him. This is Kafka's biggest problem. Because her damage relies so heavily on the dot applied by her team, the investment to get her damage to where it needs to be is really high, and something that I would think about before pulling for her. If you're a free-to-play player that doesn't have at least a good Sampo, her damage isn't going to be very impressive. This isn't meant to discourage you from pulling for her, because at the end of the day, whether or not you like the character is far more important than the damage, but it's important to understand that she relies very heavily on her team to perform well. Before moving on, I wanted to bring up Serval because she also does damage over time, but it's shock. You can still use her if you have her built. Shock from different sources stacks, so you can still have both Kafka's shock and Serval shock on the same enemy, and they aren't going to interfere with each other. If she's the only dot character that you have built, she actually makes a pretty good option as a second dot character or in place of Sampo while you level them up. The last thing I want to go over are her Eidolons and how much impact they have on her gameplay. As with most characters, Kafka is perfectly good at E0, and I would only pull for copies if you love how she plays and want to make her better. There's nothing in her Eidolons that I think is worth spending money on, but if you are going to pull for Eidolons, you're not going to be disappointed. Kafka's E1 gives her follow-up attack a 100% base chance to apply a debuff that increases damage over time by 30% for 2 turns. Because this impacts all damage over time, this is a massive buff to your entire party, and it's going to make a triple dot team a lot more viable. But something to keep in mind if you do pull for this is that it's only a 100% base chance. This doesn't mean it's guaranteed, and you're going to need to hit closer to 67% effect hit rate if you decide to go for this. If you do, try to get that extra effect hit rate on your substats before getting an effect hit rate body piece. Her E2 gives her entire party a 25% damage over time buff as long as she's on the field. Like her E1, this makes having a triple dot team far more competitive. Like everyone else, her E3 gives +2 to her skill and +1 to her basic attack, and her E5 gives +2 to her ultimate and talent. Her E4 makes it so that when an enemy takes damage from from specifically her shock, she regenerates 2 energy. Out of all of her Eidolons, this is the least interesting, but if you're going to do content with a lot of easy to kill enemies, this paired with her major trace that gives energy on kill is going to boost her AoE significantly by letting her spam her ultimate far more frequently. And finally, her E6 makes it so that the shock applied by her ultimate talent and technique has a damage increase multiplier of 156% and lasts 1 extra turn. All of these are really strong. If you're going to be pulling though, I would stop at E1 or E2. E1 is the biggest team power spike and E2 is the second highest. E6 is strong for her personal damage, but unless she's the only damage over time character on the team, it's not going to contribute as much as her first 2 Eidolons do. And with that, thank you for watching. Kafka is a pretty niche character and one that outside a simulated universe, I'm not sure how much I'll play. It's not that I think she's bad, but she needs some setup to be good, and at least in the first few days of playing her, I wasn't very impressed. But I think that's more of a problem with the options of support and damage over time characters that we currently have available. When you have her set up correctly, and especially when fighting more than one enemy, her damage is actually pretty crazy. When we finally get another 5-star damage over time character or better 4 stars, I'd really like to revisit her and see how she pairs with them, because all it takes for her damage to get completely out of hand is one really strong damage over time character. If you made it this far, thank you very much. If there was something that I got wrong or you don't agree with, let me know. I'd also really like to know your experience with Kafka has been so far, especially Memory of Chaos if you do it. I'm not really somebody that goes through Memory of Chaos very often, but she seemed to completely steamroll Mach 10, and I'm wondering if that's the same experience that everybody else has. I'd really like to know how she compares to other damage carries that you have.